Hi everyone, welcome to week 2. This week we are going to be reading Descartes' Meditations, and so the lectures are going to be entirely on reconstruction of Descartes. Now, before I begin with Descartes proper, it's important to understand that this Descartes reading is going to be very important for the rest of the semester. The next few weeks we're going to be really looking at a number of responses to Descartes, and similarly, like a lot of the ideas that are developed in early modern philosophy sort of come out of the program that's announced in the Meditations. And so the reading that we're doing for this week is really important to understanding everything for the rest of the semester. It also really helps because a lot of people will sort of indiscriminately call a bunch of different aspects of Descartes' project Cartesian. And usually this is used as kind of like an insult in philosophy. To say that someone has like a Cartesian theory of something is usually to say that they don't have like a very good theory of it. And the reason why that's the case is because many of the sort of like programs that we now think of as alive in contemporary philosophy, this includes both continental philosophy and analytic philosophy, positions itself as, in some sense, a rejection of Descartes. But it's important to parse out, like, what exactly is the nature of that rejection? What parts of Descartes are we skeptical of whenever we say that something is Cartesian, and by saying that we mean something pejorative? What exactly are we referring to? People actually refer to a bunch of different parts of Descartes' Meditations as being Cartesian. And so what we're going to do for the next 2 lectures is we're going to split up the Meditations into roughly 2 parts, and you can see that there's 6 meditations, and I've written the basic topic addressed in each of them on the board. So I'll move out of the way so that you can see that better. So the first meditation is really about Descartes' skeptical method. The second meditation is about the cogito, and we're going to be talking more in depth about that in this video. So if you don't know what that is, that's totally okay. And that's going to be the focus of this video. I'm going to cut up the Descartes material into 2 different videos so that it's not too long for anyone, and because I think that the book really does sort of allow itself to be divided into 2 parts. So for this first video, we're going to be discussing skepticism and Descartes' Cogito Argument. And then for the next video, which should be posted at the same time, we're going to be discussing God, the idea of clear and distinct ideas, God again, as well as the nature of bodies, and then finally some of Descartes' reflections on the difference between intellect and the imagination. So for this video, we're focusing on Meditations 1 and 2, and here is where really a lot of the background, a lot of the stuff that you read for last week is going to be particularly relevant, because the situation that Descartes faces is that Descartes himself was an experimental scientist. He made important contributions to optics, so scientific investigation of how we see and light and things of that nature. It doesn't stand up to contemporary scrutiny, but most science from the 17th century doesn't. He was also really interested in medicine and anatomy. Like I mentioned in the previous video, he would dissect animals on a semi-regular basis, which is maybe a little weird. And so, yeah, these are important features or dimensions of Descartes' situation, is that he is sort of part of this natural scientific experimental science innovation that happens during the 16th, 17th centuries especially. And so he faces the situation, the very same one that's described by Montaigne and Bacon, and to some smaller extent Galileo as well, where the overturning of religious orthodoxy really requires the replacement of that religious orthodoxy as a worldview for something else that can make sense of these new discoveries that that are brought forward by a number of the natural scientists that we discussed last week. And so the way that this manifests for Descartes is really, I think, characterized by the first meditation. Now, people will talk about Cartesian skepticism. And it's important to recognize that this kind of skepticism is a little bit different than skepticisms that have emerged previously in the history of philosophy. So like in an ancient Greek tradition, you would have a number of philosophers who thought that it was important for ethical reasons to sort of renounce big knowledge claims. And so they would claim that, there were equally good reasons for believing something as well as its opposite, so there's no real reason for why you would prefer one over the other. And so if you wanted to achieve satisfaction, you would have to be indifferent to that. Importantly, Descartes' skepticism is not really like that. Descartes isn't actually saying that we don't know anything. Descartes starts the meditations by saying like, hey, we've discovered in recent years that many of the things that we had sort of taken for granted in our knowledge claims are actually wrong. Geocentrism is one thing, circular orbits is another thing, and there's all sorts of things like this that Descartes is trying to account for. So he says, okay, so we've discovered that many of the fundamental things that we believe are wrong, and moreover, those beliefs played an important inferential role in our other beliefs. So, because the universe is structured in such a way that humans are at the center of it, then we can know that the world is really made for human beings, that, so on and so forth. And so Descartes really wants to examine the way that these unfounded religious beliefs really play a very toxic role for our knowledge claims. That if we have all these beliefs, that are not true, that have no justificatory status, and they're sort of baked in to the ordinary beliefs that we have about everyday phenomena, then we don't know the extent to which our ordinary beliefs are really justified by these claims that don't have any justification whatsoever. And so Descartes is at a really pivotal moment, because what he suggests is skepticism not as like a philosophical belief, but as a method. And this is very important. Descartes is, I believe, the first to establish methodological skepticism. So in other words, what Descartes wants to do is Descartes says, okay, well, we have all of these claims made by religious authorities that turn out to be unfounded. They seem essential for our everyday beliefs. So what we need to do is we need to essentially start over. We need a new foundation of our knowledge. We need a method whereby we can discover knowledge claims that we can be certain are true and are not, subject to revision in the same way that our previous claims are. And so this is sort of why it's very easy to point to Descartes as this sort of innovative moment in the history of philosophy. That like really with Descartes, you have a new beginning. Nothing is sort of taken for granted, or at least that's the intention, is that nothing is taken for granted, and that philosophy really can start over and only accept claims that it itself can justify and make sense of. And importantly, Descartes' criterion for knowledge is dubitability. So is it possible for me to doubt it? The basic idea is if we start with beliefs that are impossible to doubt or even incoherent to doubt, and then we just infer on the basis of those beliefs that are certainly true, then we can arrive at a completely purified epistemological framework where we can discover, the true nature of reality without being caught up in these false and illusory beliefs. So Descartes' point isn't that we need to actually doubt, everything that is subject to the methodological skepticism. Like Descartes believes in the data that we get from the senses, for example. He believes that, I see a coffee mug or a webcam or whatever, and those things are real, even if, my ability to doubt them is also real. And so it's important that we understand the first meditation is really proposing a new program for philosophy to really actualize, which is to sort of rediscover, based on its own reasoning, its own foundation, the claims of philosophy and knowledge that are really justified, and sorting out the ones that are not. And so in the first meditation, there's really 3 arguments that much of our current knowledge is doubtable. And first, Descartes turns to the senses. And so, this in a lot of ways really represents the Montesquieu that we discussed last week. Descartes points out that our senses are frequently wrong, that they are subject to optical illusions. There's a lot of writing around this time that, it appears like the sun is not as large as it is. It seems like the sun revolves around the earth because of our perspective. But we know that that is wrong from a scientific perspective. So that already points to the ways in which our sense data, our ability to understand the world, is very limited and is subject to doubt. But then, even furthermore, Descartes points out that there is no principled way to distinguish the sense data that I experience when I'm awake from the sense data that I experience whenever I'm asleep. So when you're asleep, you can have very lively impressions. It can really feel like you're in that room taking that exam in that class that you never actually registered for or whatever. And this is a commonly recurring nightmare, and it feels very visceral to people. It's one that I have as well. And so Descartes' point is that, what happens in those sort of situations is that you eventually wake up and you revise the beliefs that you previously had. Previously, you thought, because you had a nightmare, that you were in the middle of a classroom about to take a final. But, upon waking up, you discovered that, all of that stuff was false and really just a dream, and, something that you were experiencing on your own that doesn't reflect really the nature of the world at all. And Descartes' point is that we don't have any principled reason for thinking that that couldn't happen to our experience while we are awake. And so the possibility, he doesn't need to actually think that we're all dreaming now. His point is just that it is possible for us to think of our knowledge as something that we could revise fundamentally at a later point because of the same situation that happens whenever we're asleep. This might be a cultural reference that is too old for younger students, but if you're familiar with The Matrix, this is a movie where basically people are sucked up and they're put in basically virtual reality machines, and the idea is that everyone is living their life in a virtual reality machine and they don't know it until Neo, the protagonist, it goes out and discovers it and tries to free everyone and so on. So the idea is okay, in the same way that I could discover that my previous reality was a dream, that all of my sense data before didn't reflect reality in the way that I thought, that's another way that we could come to revise our fundamental beliefs about our knowledge, is that we could discover that we were in a virtual reality machine, or we were really a brain in a vat, or something to that extent. And so from this, Descartes takes the idea that, okay, so we can definitely doubt all of the data that we get from the senses. That's certainly true because all of this is fundamentally revisable. Here his argument is very similar to Montesquieu. However, Descartes also says, okay, well, so this would get rid of a lot of our sciences. It would get rid of astronomy, it would get rid of medicine and so on, but it wouldn't get rid of mathematical knowledge or geometry, you know, like 2 plus 2 equals 4, like that's the case whether I'm dreaming or not, right? So then Descartes says, like, what if there was the equivalent of God in terms of their ability to have power over us and manipulate us, but this God were evil, it were an evil demon. An evil demon tried to deceive us and make us believe very viscerally that 2 plus 2 equals 4, whereas that was really an illusion. And so Descartes considers this as well. And, you know, while he doesn't think that this is realistic, and ultimately he's going to have arguments to the effect that this cannot be the case, that we can't be constantly deceived by an evil demon, he considers it for a moment to just show that even the sort of knowledge that we have from mathematics that isn't based on our sense data is itself also potentially subject to doubt. And so here Descartes has effectively eliminated all the sciences and religious orthodoxy and all of that as a suitable foundation for modern kinds of knowledge. And that's really what happens in the first meditations. You sort of end on this skeptical mode, uncertain of you know, what's going to happen next, how you could potentially rebuild the sort of knowledge that we're really after. And so the second meditation attempts to discover a suitable starting point for our knowledge. It's like, okay, so if, you know, sense data and sciences, mathematics and geometry, if they aren't suitable foundations of our knowledge, then what is? And here Descartes makes reference to an Archimedean point. And the basic idea here is like, okay, well, if I can get some, as I mentioned earlier, if I can get some kind of knowledge that is not even coherent to doubt, then I can make inferences based on that idea. You know, I can discover other things from that. And then I can be certain about those too, because they're certain in virtue of the thing that they were an inference from. And so the idea of an Archimedean point is like, if I could just find something that isn't subject to this doubt, then I can at least start to rebuild our idea of knowledge, rebuild one way of understanding the sciences and the world around us. And Descartes' way of doing this is typically referred to as the Cogito Argument. And so the Latin is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And here's the basic idea. The basic idea is this. So while I can doubt whether or not the world exists, like I can think, you know, that I'm fundamentally deceived, as in the case where I'm dreaming, or a mad person, or you know, deceived by an evil demon, and so on. All of those things are coherent, like I can make sense of that sort of doubt. The world can not exist, or at least exist in a fundamentally different way than I can understand it. But I cannot coherently doubt my own existence. It does not make sense. Even if I am wrong about everything else, I have to be right about the fact that I am a thinking thing. I know this in virtue of the immediacy of that kind of knowledge. To the very possibility of knowing or not knowing, or being in doubt or being in error and so on, is dependent on my existence as a thinking thing. The very possibility of considering something that I can make a judgment on and deciding yes or no already presupposes as its fundamental basis that I'm the sort of thing that can do that, you know? And so here is where we sort of introduce what is often referred to as Cartesian dualism. So Descartes is very careful here, right? So you have to view the first meditation, the second meditation really together. So the Cogito Argument establishes something that we can know beyond all doubt. It's not even coherent for me to think that to doubt that I exist, to doubt that I'm capable of rendering judgments, because that is incoherent with my giving a judgment on the matter itself. But it's important now that we think about what we really are, right? So like one thing that would be very natural is like, okay, well I know I exist, and so I'm Penny, and like, you know, I'm Penelope, and I'm almost 6 feet tall, and I can list all these empirical features about myself. But these are the sort of things that are still in doubt at this point, this sort of knowledge that I get from the senses. And so given that all this stuff is still dubitable, I don't have the ability to infer from the fact that I'm thinking all of these empirical features about myself, that I'm so and so tall, that I, what my name is, and all these other features about myself. And so Descartes rejects the traditional understanding of human beings as a rational animal because he's like, okay, well, this introduces way too much. Then we have the idea of rationality and animality, and we have the whole idea of like a genus and a species. So the genus is a general category animal, and the species is the specific kind of animal that we are in reference to other animals, which would be rational. For Descartes, this just assumes way too much stuff. It is sort of like Aristotelian baggage at this point, and it's just not the sort of thing that we've really justified at this point. So what Descartes says is that I know myself as a thinking thing. I don't have any further determination for what that thinking thing is. So I can know that I'm thinking, but I don't know any of the empirical features about my actual self. So we are all cogitos. We are all thinking substances for Descartes, in spite of all the differences between all of the empirical features about our identities and all that kind of stuff. This is really interesting. Proto-feminist authors tried to use Descartes' Cogito argument to justify, to argue against the oppression of women. That okay, well, if we're all just thinking things, then the material aspect of our existence, our bodies or whatever else, are not relevant for that dimension of our existence. And my knowledge that I exist is not conditioned by anything outside myself. Like whenever I see things, this is conditioned by the sort of eyes that I have, light as a medium for my ability to see, and so on. And so that's a very conditioned and hence dubious form of knowledge. Whereas the cogito is absolutely not conditioned. There's nothing about the world that could be different that would affect my ability to know that I exist in virtue of my ability to even render a judgment about the fact. And so this means that the cogito has a special status with respect to all these different empirical features about the world, that it's immediate and unconditioned kind of knowledge, and it's the perfect suitable starting point for the methodological skepticism that Descartes establishes at this point. So really what happens in the first two meditations, and then I'll actually talk about the wax example that happens in the second meditations, is that you have the institution of a program for methodological doubt. So you go through and you say, okay, what of all of our knowledge is potentially subject to doubt? And it turns out that things that are conditioned are subject to doubt, and things that are mediated are subject to doubt. So they're conditioned in virtue of various features about the world affecting them, and they're mediated because they only occur through some medium. So in the same way that our vision is mediated by light. And so, but Descartes says, okay, well, and if we want to be able to be absolutely certain about our knowledge, then we need to actually overturn all of our beliefs that are wrong, that sort of mix in unjustified bits without really thinking about it, and to develop a method, a pure method for discovering what is actually worth keeping in the sciences that we have now. We need something that we can't be deceived or wrong about. And Descartes thinks that he's discovered that with the Cogito argument, by discovering that there's a certain kind of immediate self-knowledge that comes from us as subjects, as thinking things. And this is revealed, Descartes believes, in his wax example that comes out in the second meditation. So Descartes tries to say, okay, well, think of, some, like a wax candle. And in this wax candle, so many of the things that we discover about it through the senses are variable, right? So, we can say that it takes up a certain a certain amount of space, and it's shaped a certain way, and it has a certain texture, a certain temperature, smells a certain way, so on, right? But all of those features can be variable. If you leave the light on the candle for too long, then its shape is going to change, the smell is going to change, and so on. So all the things that we know from the senses are revisable. But for Descartes, what we know through the mind, through thinking about it, is that what the candle really is not any of these qualities, like nice smelling or certain shape or whatever. We know of it as a body, namely as something that's extended in space. It takes up a certain amount of space, and that you can modify all of those characteristics that we learn about through the senses, but we can't actually modify what we know about the candle through the mind, which is that it's an extended thing. It's a body that occupies a certain space. And so the mind on its own learns the essential qualities of objects, while the senses can only learn like contingent qualities that are subject to change, and so cannot be sort of the durable foundation that we need for scientific knowledge. And so Descartes is sort of beginning the establishment of a rationalist program. He's sort of shown that while many of our beliefs are empirically founded, those empirically founded beliefs are not the center of our knowledge. The center or foundation of our knowledge, the thing on which everything else depends, is something that we can know in virtue of reason alone. Now, to really understand what Descartes means with the wax example, we're going to have to talk a little bit more about his understanding of bodies, the difference between a mind and a body, and that's going to have to happen in the next video where we discuss meditations 3 through 6. I hope this is helpful. Bye.